My beloved wife and I were expecting our first child. It was a very touching moment in our history. But the whole story took on a dark hue when a week before giving birth I found out that my wife had a long-term affair on the side. I didn't know what to do, but I knew for sure that I wouldn't just leave it like that. The setting appeared picturesque, reminiscent of a Norman Rockwell depiction of familial bliss, though not one likely to grace the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. On one side of the hospital bed stood my mother-in-law. On the other, my own mother, both casting affectionate gazes upon my wife and our newborn daughter as she nursed. Newborns aren't conventionally considered cute, but naturally parents and grandparents tend to see them differently. However, as I observed, I couldn't deny that our little girl wasn't too bad looking. Her complexion had shifted from mottled red to a delicate pink. The waxy vernix that coated her just a day ago had been washed away, and even her initially cone-shaped head was starting to round out nicely. I had a feeling that over time she would come to resemble her mother, Susan, my wife of 6 years, and the love of my life. I quietly observed Susan nursing our baby as both our mothers offered unnecessary coaching. Yet, Susan seemed naturally adept, likely due to the parenting classes we had attended together, which covered breastfeeding and newborn care extensively. As I stepped aside, a nurse and another woman entered the room. "This is Ms. Denkins from administration. She has the birth certificate application for you to complete," the nurse, whose name eluded me, informed us. In any other context of our society, the scene would seem surreal. A woman nursing her baby without a shirt on while others discuss business. But here it's commonplace. "Take your time. Finish nursing your baby," Ms. Denkins instructed Susan. "When you have a moment, complete the details in the highlighted spaces. Most of the information we need is likely in your hospital records, like your date and place of birth. But we'll also require your and your husband's full names, your maiden name, your ages, and a few other details. We'll handle the rest and submit it to the parish courthouse on your behalf. You'll receive a copy of the birth certificate by mail in a couple of weeks." With that, Ms. Denkins turned and left. "Darling, why don't you take this and fill in the details?" "I'm quite busy at the moment," Susan suggested with a smile that I didn't return. "No, I think I'll let you handle it later when you're not occupied with the baby," I replied. "Besides, I believe we should wait until the DNA tests come back to confirm whether I'm the father or not." If this were a movie scene, you might imagine the abrupt halt as the needle screeched across the record. All movement ceased. For those unfamiliar with records due to being born in the digital age, they were vinyl discs onto which sound was physically etched with a stylus into grooves. By tracing these grooves with a needle and utilizing electricity, the sound would play. But I digress. To say my audience was stunned would be an understatement. 3 out of the 4 women gazed at me, mouths open in shock. The fourth, a baby, was the only one not looking, yet the only one to react audibly when her feeding was abruptly interrupted. Her cry barely drowned out the collective gasps of the 3 women. "My mother-in-law was the first to react. Are you out of your mind? Why would you even consider such a thing?" Then she glanced at Susan, whose expression shifted from astonishment to speculation, and finally to an angry glare. "How dare you accuse me of having another man's baby? What kind of woman do you take me for?" Then she paused, attempting a smile that fell short. "Oh, I see, it's April Fool's Day. You're playing a prank on us. Well, that's not funny at all. You should know better." Her body language contradicted her words. Her shock was apparent. I stood there observing her. "I'm not joking in the slightest," I replied coldly. "There's a strong possibility I'm not the father." "How could you ever think I'd cheat on you? Have I ever given you any reason to doubt me? Name just one instance where I've given you cause to believe I'm seeing someone else." Instead of addressing her question, I remarked, "So you're resorting to your default response. Deny, deny, deny. And you're even doing it with a straight face. I'm impressed." I addressed my mother-in-law, suggesting, Maybe I should transfer the car seat from my vehicle to yours so you can take her and the baby home this afternoon. It would be helpful if you could stay with Susan for a while. Although both you and Mom have offered before, we insisted we could manage. However, she could really use the support since I won't be there. As I turned to leave the room, a sharp command from behind halted me. "Stop right there, Jason Louis Fontenot." My mother's voice commanded my attention. "You can't just walk away after saying something like that." Obeying, I paused and faced my mother, preparing to respond. Both my mother and mother-in-law exchanged glances with me and Susan, who had begun crying uncontrollably. "No, you can't leave me and little Connie. She's our baby. You're her daddy." Before addressing my own mother, I replied to my wife, "I understand I'm meant to be the daddy, but am I truly the father? There's a distinction, you know." My mom snapped me to attention with a poke to my chest. Closing the short distance between us, she seized the front of my shirt and pulled me close, locking eyes with me, just as she had when I was a child. "What the hell is going on with you, Jason? Why the sudden brain-dead act? You can't be having second thoughts about fatherhood now. That ship has sailed. You've been overjoyed since Sue first told us she was pregnant. Damn it, you've been running around devouring every baby care book out there. You bought and put together the crib, changing table, and everything else in that nursery. Not to mention painting the walls pink and yellow with cute little animals everywhere. Every single week, you bring home a new toy for that baby. Some of them she won't even be able to use until she starts walking." Mom finally paused, fixing me with an intense stare. "So why the sudden change of heart?" "I've had a bit of a revelation," I admitted. "I'm not as gung-ho about this whole thing anymore. I'm sure you've noticed." "Hey," Tony, my mother-in-law, interjected from the side. "We've all noticed you haven't once held Connie or even taken a good look at her. We found it odd and assumed the reality of parenthood was just hitting you. What's going on?" "If that baby is mine, I'll step up and take care of her. I'll do everything I can to be the best father possible," I declared with such fervor that both my mother and Tony recoiled. I was fully committed to being a dad. But that changed last week when I found out I might not even be the father. I refuse to form a bond with a child I won't be helping to raise. "What?" came the outcry from three voices nearly in unison. "I'll provide for the baby if she's mine. But if not, Clive Adams can take responsibility for his own child," I asserted loudly. At the mention of that name, Susan suddenly exclaimed, "Clive and I never did anything. We've never had intimacy. How can you say that?" As I approached the foot of her bed, Mom and Tony exchanged glances, their eyes shifting between Susan and me. "Really? Are you still going to deny that you haven't had an affair in almost 6 months? And that you ended it 7 months ago only after discovering you were pregnant and informing him? As I understand it, he instructed you to ensure I never found out he might have been involved." "No, we absolutely did not, and anyone who says otherwise is lying," Susan shouted. "Who is Clive Adams? And who told you about this alleged affair?" Tony demanded. "I want to know who's spreading rumors about my daughter." I brushed off the first question and addressed the second one simply. "Clive Adams himself," I replied quietly. Before she could fully process it, and perhaps due to her exhaustion and distress, Susan exclaimed, "Clive would never tell you that. He promised." Tony shifted her gaze between me and her daughter, having caught on to Susan's words. "I need to know what you know," she stated. I hesitated for a moment before addressing my wife. "Clive spilled everything and divulged all about you. But let's be real, he was under some pressure at the time. So he spilled his guts between his screams," I admitted. "Rubbish. Clive was perfectly fine yesterday when he called to check on me and the baby," Susan retorted, her stress evident post-childbirth, possibly unaware of her slip-up. Yet her words resonated truthfully with all of us. Tony slouched momentarily, and I glanced at my own mother, who observed wide-eyed, absorbing it all. "So you're still keeping up with your old flame," I remarked. "Did he give you any more pointers on how to keep me in the dark about the possibility of him being the father?" Susan broke down into tears, her cries so intense that 2 nurses hurried into the room. "We were so careful. There's no way you could have known. Nobody knew." "She's just a bit shocked," I explained to the first nurse, who shot me a defensive glare on behalf of her patient. I suppose my tone might have come across as odd to her. "We were just discussing potential fathers for her to list on the birth certificate application." The nurse continued to eye me skeptically. "Well, it seems she expects me to fill in my name. I'd prefer to wait and confirm whether I'm the father or if it's the jerk she was involved with when she got pregnant." I could tell the nurse noticed a change in expression, indicating the light was turning on for her. She shifted her focus to soothing Susan. "Ms. Fontenot, let's calm down now. Take deep breaths, like you did during labor. Cheryl will fetch something to help you relax if needed, but let's try natural methods first. We don't want to risk anything getting into your milk, right? So, let's start with breathing exercises. Inhale with me, deeply." As I observed the nurse calming Susan, I didn't notice my mom and mother-in-law approaching. "You need to explain what's happening," my mom whispered sharply. I was taken aback. My mom rarely used such language, but she had already uttered it twice today. "Something clearly happened, judging by Sue's reaction," my mother-in-law remarked. "I want to know the details. What, when, and how. This is completely unexpected." "Well, that should be apparent," I retorted, glaring at both women. I was becoming irritated that I was the focus of their frustration rather than Susan. She was involved with a co-worker when she got pregnant. At least one other guy besides me that I know of. I can't say for certain if there were others. Susan regained composure remarkably quickly, considering she appeared to be on the brink of a breakdown just moments before. "How?" "We were so careful," she asked, her tone filled with desperation. I saw the same inquisitive glance from Mom and Tony. They were eager to understand. "Yes, you were very discreet. I had no clue. Neither did anyone else," I confessed. "Unfortunately, Clive is quite the skilled persuader. To secure his next conquest, or, in this case, his latest seduction, he felt the need to demonstrate his prowess. You're familiar with Cheryl Watkins, right?" She nodded, confirming my assumption, as she and Cheryl had been co-workers for years. Cheryl and her husband Steve were part of our social circle. Well, Clive targeted Cheryl and nearly had her convinced to join him at a hotel room. Her main concern was that Clive might blab and her husband would find out. She was unsure if she could trust him to keep quiet. To prove his discretion, he disclosed a few details about his past affairs, or whatever you want to call them. Conquests, liaisons, girlfriends. He mentioned some names and provided enough information to convince her. He even asked if she knew of anyone he might have been involved with, excluding the girlfriends he was publicly dating. Married women or even single women from the office. Naturally, she couldn't. So, in order to convince her that he could be trusted with a secret, he mentioned a few women from the office whom she knew. "The one prior to you was Sandy, I believe. She backed out after a few months when she became concerned that her husband was becoming suspicious. Then it was you for 6 months, but you ended things when you discovered you were pregnant. He mentioned that you were hoping your husband was the father of the baby, but he wasn't willing to continue the affair. He stressed to Cheryl how important it was that her husband, meaning me, never found out because he feared I might end things with Sue and not want to deal with child support. During that time, you were quite open about your pregnancy. You were very happy and shared the news with everyone in the office as soon as you found out. I noticed that Susan, despite her excitement about being pregnant, showed no concern whatsoever about the baby's parentage. It seemed she assumed I wouldn't suspect anything, and even if I did, I'd still be invested in the child and overlook any doubts. However, that wasn't something I was willing to accept. It turns out Lana Richard was his next lover. Her husband grew suspicious when she started working late suddenly, so she had to be careful. She ended up being late to pick up their youngest child from daycare a few times when it was her turn. Because of this glitch in his bed life, Clive turned his attention to Cheryl and was successful again. Like I mentioned, he was a skilled salesman, telling her exactly what she wanted to hear to win her over. Apparently, he was quite adept in bed too, keeping his married partner satisfied and returning to him for months. Tony and Mom exchanged glances, then turned to Susan. "How or why did Cheryl supposedly confess then?" Mom inquired. "It wasn't intentional. It seems that Cheryl tends to speak loudly during intimacy," I explained. She accidentally called out Clive's name in the heat of the moment. Her husband, Steve, pressed her about it, and she spilled the beans. I chuckled for a moment, remembering the story Steve told over a beer. Cheryl wasn't the type to just exclaim primal sounds like Susan during intimacy. Cheryl preferred to voice her wishes. According to Steve, one night during intimacy, Cheryl exclaimed, "Give it to me, Clive. I love it." I continued my explanation. Steve sounded nothing like Clive, and Steve, of course, knew Clive and was well aware of his reputation as a womanizer, or as we guys call it, a ladies' man. He connected the dots and jumped to conclusions. Steve confronted Cheryl directly. That's how he described it to me when Larry, Lana's husband, was present. He was a bit worried that Larry, being a police officer, might report him for threatening his wife, saying, "You better start talking or else I'll have to decide whether to beat." She wisely chose to speak up. Steve, a man of integrity, confided in me, saying, "Jason, I felt it was necessary to inform you that there's a chance you may not be the father of the child your wife is carrying. I hope you'd do the same for me if you discovered my wife was unfaithful." I assured him that I would indeed reciprocate. As we sat together, we contemplated Clive's situation. Honestly, if he turns out to be the father, I'll let him deal with the child and the woman on his own. He'll struggle to keep up with child support payments, I remarked. I'll also make it clear to him that if he doesn't step up for the child, he might not have the capability to continue his affairs. Steve mentioned that Clive might not have much time left with his abilities anyway. He planned to inform Sandy's husband, whom he didn't know as well as Larry and me. He vaguely remembered him from high school as someone with a short fuse who might spill the beans prematurely. We agreed to wait a week before taking any action to spare Susan from the added stress of her affair becoming public knowledge. Larry was furious but consented to keep quiet for another week. Now that the baby had arrived, it was time to divulge the truth about Clive and his indiscretions. I gave Tony and Mom a watered-down version of the story. They both appreciated my discretion during Sue's final stages of pregnancy. Tony and Mom guided me into the hallway to have a discussion away from Susan's presence, aiming to avoid further distress. Meanwhile, the second nurse had swiftly taken the baby, Connie, to the nursery for the time being. "So, why do you seem so composed?" Mom inquired. "I can sense your distress, but it's not as intense as I would expect." My explanation that I had a whole week to process the situation somewhat reassured her. "All right, you've had time to reflect. I trust you'll inform me. Well, us. When you're ready." Mom understood me well. "So when are you planning to collect the samples for the DNA test?" Tony asked. She seemed a bit surprised to learn that they had already been submitted. I had spoken with the head nurse the day before after the baby was born. As Susan and I were married, I was already presumed to be the father, hence I didn't need Susan's consent to test the baby. I had opted for an expedited test, and it would take 2 to 3 days to receive the results. Tony tentatively inquired, "Do you think you could find it in yourself to forgive Sue and move past this, even if you're not the biological father of the baby?" I noticed she referred to the child as the baby instead of using her name, a departure from her usual practice. Tony was astute and could read me well, but it was evident she held on to hope. Glancing at my own mother, I saw that she had already discerned my intentions, and while she understood, she wasn't pleased. "To be honest, I'm not certain I can move past this, even if I am the father," I confessed. "I've had just over a week to mull this over. This wasn't a mere slip-up, like a drunken one-night stand. It was a 6-month affair. I can't trust her anymore. Not only did she show blatant disrespect for me and our marriage, But she also knew the risk of getting pregnant by that jerk while we were actively trying for a baby. She had told the whole family that we had decided to conceive. Her continued relationship with Clive demonstrates to me that she simply didn't care which of us fathered her child. "Have you considered couples therapy?" Mom interjected, perhaps to preempt arguments from Susan's family. "And I urge you to think about the baby. It's not her fault. That little girl is going to need a father. Even if you're not her biological father, you could still be her daddy." "Just as I mentioned earlier, Mom, I doubt therapy will help at all. What I really want to understand is where I went wrong as a husband. There must have been something I either did or didn't do for Susan to betray me. And it's not like she was actively seeking to replace me." "Clive has a reputation as a womanizer. He'd never commit to her, and I'm certain she knew that. I'm trying to refrain from using harsh words that come to mind like womanizer, scoundrel, jerk. Neither of them deserves my wrath, but I'm feeling extremely tense and close to losing it. Besides the physical aspect, or perhaps a bit of thrill on the side, I can't see any other reason. I believed we had a strong relationship. You can only imagine how devastated I've been since I found out. Just like you said, Mom, I was elated at the thought of becoming a father. Then, out of nowhere, everything fell apart. My whole world crumbled. Frankly, right now, I almost hope I'm not the father." Both women seemed taken aback by that admission. "Then I wouldn't have to navigate being a part-time dad. Honestly, I'm not sure I can handle dealing with Susan, even if the child is mine. That alone will require extensive therapy." The nurse emerged from the room and informed me, "Mr. Fontenot, your wife wishes to speak with you. She mentioned she knew you were still here, otherwise her mother would have returned by now." She conveyed a sense of sympathy towards my emotions, or at least it seemed that way. Yet, she halted me before I could return, cautioning, "If you do go back in, I hope you can remain relatively calm. I understand you're upset, but try not to agitate her too much. We'd prefer not to resort to sedation. She's scheduled for discharge this afternoon. Additionally, it wouldn't be ideal to introduce extra medication that could pass to the baby through her milk. And based on your childbirth classes, I trust you understand the importance of colostrum and early maternal milk in boosting the baby's immune system." I nodded, realizing she was appealing to my concern for the child's welfare, whether it was my own or not. "Maybe you should go talk to her," Mom suggested gently. "Tony and I can grab a cup of coffee. Give me your car keys. We'll move the car seat. I'll wait for you to finish your conversation. Oh, and on your way out, swing by the nursery and take a good look at Connie. I think she bears a striking resemblance to you when you were born." "Wishful thinking, Mom? Or are you simply seeing what you hope to see?" I inquired. She shrugged, clearly discontent with the situation. I knew that if I were the father, she would be there to help raise the baby, regardless of my involvement with Susan. She had invested heavily in her role as a grandmother, just as I had in becoming a father. It was evident she hadn't fully come to terms with the possibility that the child might not be her grandchild. I entered the room, and upon seeing me, Susan broke into tears once more. "You must hate me," she sobbed. "No, I don't hate you. That's the issue. I despise what you did, and I'm so furious I can hardly think straight," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. Inside, I wanted to shake her and storm out. If it weren't for the slight chance of the baby being mine, I would have left already. Plus, I needed some answers. "Do you really want to talk now, or do you need a few extra days to figure out how to explain this?" I added with an obvious edge to my tone. "I don't need days, Susan started, but I cut her off despite wanting answers. "Yeah, you've had 9 months to think about what to say if I ever found out about you cheating with that bastard Clive Adams. Of all people, Clive Adams." I seethed, pausing to take a few deep breaths. "No, I really didn't think he might be the father. That was you. I was having our baby, not his." Susan defended herself. Your baby. I might be the father, but it's doubtful, I retorted. To her credit, she looked shocked. Oh, come on. I was still offshore on a rig the first week of July when you supposedly got pregnant. Most of it, anyway, as I got back toward the end of the week. I double-checked my work schedules for that time frame. Sure, I remember we made up for lost time and were intimate as soon as I got home, like we usually do. Or used to do. I thought that's how you got pregnant. That's what I told guys at work later. I had no idea Clive was involved at the same time. Susan began to protest. I interrupted her. Okay, the weeks leading up to it, right until I got off the helicopter. Did you have him over while I was away? Move him in? Did you sleep with him in our bed? It's not that it matters where you were close, it's just that you did it. No, Susan exclaimed. He never came to the house except for those few times when we hosted barbecues and invited people from work. We were very careful. We wouldn't risk a neighbor seeing him or a strange car at the house. But you weren't careful enough to avoid getting pregnant, so you can't claim one broke. Clive strikes me as a guy who takes risks or at least pushes boundaries as long as he comes out on top. I did get checked for STDs this past week. I suggest you get screened anyway, I said. Susan muttered barely audibly that it was part of her early pregnancy examinations. I didn't think that was routine, I offered, a little surprised. I told my doctor I wanted to make sure you hadn't caught something while away on business, Susan said sheepishly. I'd spend 2 or 3 weeks on one oil rig or another and then 2 weeks home. Sometimes my time home got cut short if there was a problem I needed to troubleshoot. I was well compensated for my time away, so it was never an issue. Until now. I gazed at her. So your OB-GYN suspects I might have been the one cheating. Instead of being honest, you let her believe that. I could feel my face flushing. While her doctor's opinion didn't mean much to me, it still bothered me that Susan was quick to deflect her own infidelity onto me. I have a few questions I'd like answers to. First off, why? What drove you to cheat? Secondly, why him? And why would you risk getting pregnant by Clive? Why not go back on birth control and pretend you wanted to wait longer before having a baby, so you could sleep with him without the risk? I struggled to keep my composure. I don't know, I was lonely. You were often away, I was horny, and Clive was there. We started talking, and before I knew it, we were already close. I knew he wasn't interested in anything serious. As for the next question, I was already involved with Clive before we decided I'd stop taking birth control. He refuses to use condoms. I would take a shower after, to reduce the risk a little. I know it's not the most effective method, but I thought it was the best option. Keeping your legs closed in the first place would have been a better option, I muttered sarcastically. Susan looked taken aback. I hoped she wouldn't shut down before I got answers to my other questions. So, you cheated on me for about 4 months before getting pregnant and continued for 2 more after, I stated, wanting to steer the conversation forward. Susan nodded. I had a feeling that I might be pregnant, but I didn't want to stop being active until I was sure of it. I justified it to myself, thinking that if I was already pregnant, it didn't matter if I continued dating him. I overheard you telling our mothers that Clive broke up with me. It was true. He didn't want to risk you catching him and being responsible for the child if it was his child. So you discussed possible options with him, I said. Susan nodded. Yes, we did that. We both thought you'd never suspect Connie wasn't yours and there was a good chance she was his. When you came home that first week in July, we were close all the time. Clive and I didn't see each other at all when you were at home, Susan explained. So you had a relationship with Clive when I was away, working to support our family and the lifestyle we wanted. Did you start this novel out of resentment at my absence? Or, I began, almost asking. You were just promiscuous, but held back. Was he more gifted, or was intimacy with him just better? She had already answered this question, but it still bothered me. She shook her head in refusal. I wasn't sure what exactly she was denying. It was just a physical thing. I felt desire when you were away. Clive and I only engaged in physical intimacy when you were out of town. We spent time together at his place 3 or 4 evenings a week. We were cautious. I didn't stay overnight every time. I tried to give the impression that I was mostly at home. We never displayed any affection at work to suggest we were anything more than friendly colleagues. We never left early or anything like that. I would park in his garage so no one would see me. And no, he's not better endowed, and he's not better in bed. We didn't do anything that you and I don't normally do. It's just that he was available when you weren't. It was enjoyable and thrilling. That's the best way to describe it. And no, I didn't do it to get back at you. It was something I did for myself. It started because I was feeling a bit lonely, and you know how much I enjoy intimacy. Clive was making advances, and I was somewhat flattered. He persuaded me, or I persuaded myself, that there was no harm if you never found out. I was completely committed to you when you were home. That really annoyed me. No matter how many times she repeated it or tried to justify it, I couldn't bring myself to accept it. If you were only mine when I was around, you weren't truly mine, I stated, trying to maintain a steady gaze. You were my wife, but someone else's mistress. I couldn't help but say it. You were so careful not to get caught. But then you got pregnant. I guess you never considered a few things. Like what I might do if one day I found out our oldest child wasn't mine. Maybe due to some coincidence like a difference in blood type. Or if she didn't resemble our other kids. And that's even if you didn't cheat on me again and let another man father your child next time. Or went back to Clive for another one, I added bitterly. Susan shook her head frantically. No. I swore I'd never cheat on you again. And I knew once you formed a bond you'd never abandon Connie, even if you weren't the biological father. Just look at how you've been with her. You're already completely devoted to that baby. Clive agrees. A few points. I guess you kept discussing with Clive the possibility that he was the father. You mentioned he called yesterday to check on you. And it's clear you two talked about how to handle me, keeping me unaware and anticipating my future reaction. Susan started to fidget nervously. And the key word here is was, as in, I was invested in being that baby's daddy. Both moms noticed I haven't held her once. I haven't changed her diaper, swaddled her, or even had more than a quick glance at her from a distance. I'll make an effort to change that if the DNA test confirms I'm the father after all. Let me ask you something. You never really cared whether I was the father or Clive, did you? I inquired. I wasn't surprised by her response. Well, of course I wanted you to be the father. But after I found out I was pregnant, I just wanted the baby. I knew she would be adorable and you would never suspect. You and Clive don't look that different, same hair color and build. You would be her daddy and it wouldn't matter. I hope to have you around more, to be with both of us. You know very well I've already begun reducing my time offshore. I sacrificed some of that great bonus money and started spending more time in the office instead, managing things from there. I gladly took the pay cut. You seemed happy that I was home more, or so I thought. If my absence was such an issue, you should have spoken up long ago. All you had to do was ask. I was doing it all for you. Well, that's definitely going to change if I'm not the father. I'm heading back to the rigs. I'll work out there until I find a woman who wants to be with me and only me. Not someone who can't keep her wedding vows intact and her legs closed when I'm not around, I said angrily. Susan's tears flowed once more. But I rely on you to help me care for the baby. We're a family. What about us? We've been doing so well for the past 7 months. I've been a devoted wife. I haven't even glanced at another man. We could seek counseling. At this moment, I'm uncertain if there's still an us. We'll need to figure something out if it turns out I'm the father. But for now, I won't be here. Not until I receive the DNA results. I've already packed up my things, the ones that matter to me." Her reaction was one of shock. She inquired about my whereabouts. "I've rented an apartment. I arranged it last week. I wanted to wait until after the baby's arrival before leaving. Tony will be with you for now, and my mom might lend a hand too. She's hoping it's her grandchild." With that, I turned and left. Susan wept, though not as intensely as before. I nearly collided with Tony and my mother, who had evidently been eavesdropping at the door. "Yeah, so I heard you out. Sue me," Tony remarked. "But don't lose hope. Maybe there's still a chance for reconciliation, especially if Connie is your daughter," she added optimistically. "Seriously? You claim you listened. Yet did you overlook some crucial points? Like the fact that she never once apologized for cheating? She shows no remorse. She simply justified her actions by saying she was lonely and horny, as if that somehow makes it okay. She didn't even seem concerned about whether I'm the father or not. She just expects me to clean up the mess and accept everything. That's downright despicable." Tony looked taken aback by my intensity, her eyes welling up with tears. Mom tried to diffuse the tension. "We moved the car seat and secured it in place," Mom interjected. "I'm going to pack a bag and stay for a few days, even if you're not the father. Sue has been my daughter for the past 6 years. I can't just abandon her, not yet anyway. But don't misunderstand me. I don't approve of what she did. It angers me too. If she hadn't just had a baby, I think both Tony and I would give her a piece of our minds for being so foolish." When they inquired, I disclosed the location of my new apartment, but withheld the fact that I had sought legal counsel and taken measures to safeguard my share of our assets by settling our credit card debts and securing our investment accounts. I instructed the lawyer to prepare documents citing adultery, despite its inapplicability in our state. Although Susan might be confined to home for a few days, I couldn't risk her accessing our finances online. Prioritizing caution, I had been almost certain our marriage was irreparable. The remaining fraction of doubt, stemming from my recent happiness in marriage, vanished abruptly. Trusting her, again, seemed impossible. On my way to my new apartment, I gave Steve a call. I was in need of some company over a drink. I had planned to take a few weeks off work when the baby arrived to help my wife settle in, sort of like a male version of maternity leave. Right now, being alone wasn't what I wanted. Since Steve had flexibility during the day, he joined me at the bar. He worked for his father-in-law's company and didn't think he'd keep his job for much longer, especially after Cheryl's admission. "You talked to Susan, I presume," he started. I confirmed and recounted our conversation. "I've consulted the same lawyer you did. Fortunately, Cheryl's father insisted on a prenuptial agreement when we got married. He wanted to safeguard his business, and while Cheryl holds some stock, she doesn't receive dividends or have significant influence. She'll retain the stock, but I'll be entitled to nearly everything else." We had previously discussed it, and he was aware that Susan would receive half of our shared assets, which amounted to a considerable sum. Both of us had contributed to our marriage financially, with Susan earning a good salary. I was hoping to create enough disturbance to avoid paying her alimony. I thought Tony might assist with that. As for child support, it was only a concern if the child was mine, which I still doubted. "I'm going to suffer for this," I complained. "The courts will penalize me, even though I'm innocent." Larry and I visited Don Ducat, Sandy's husband, and informed him about his wife and Clive, Steve recounted. As I expected, he was furious. Larry, being a police officer, cautioned him against doing anything foolish. I nodded. Don was angry with us and couldn't believe we were willing to let Clive off the hook for making fools of us. He called us weak for not confronting Clive as soon as we found out. Larry surprised me by saying, "Who said anything about letting that jerk off easy?" I said, "Don't do anything foolish. That means nothing that'll get you caught. Clive isn't worth going to jail over because you act impulsively." Don may be hot-headed, but he's not stupid, Steve remarked. He said, so I need to make sure I'm not caught when someone deals with Clive. We joked about it, and he settled down enough to listen. We know we have to do something to deal with that jerk. I agree. Clive needs to be dealt with, but it has to be done carefully, and castrating him is not the right solution, I explained, recounting how Clive had called Susan under the guise of checking on her and the baby, but really to ensure I remained oblivious. Steve gave me a bewildered look. You must be out of your mind, he said. He shouldn't get away with it. Even if he's incapable of fathering children, he still has financial responsibilities. And he's accountable for wrecking marriages, yours, mine, and probably Don's. Larry might stick with Lana for now because of their kids, but his decision hinges on Lana's reaction when he confronts her tonight. He's been postponing it because of you. Well, Clive's deception will unravel as soon as these women warn him, I replied. He won't stick around for long. His issue is, he's always traceable. People underestimate how difficult it is to disappear completely. You can't make a substantial income staying off the radar, especially not the kind Clive desires. Rest assured he's in trouble. But if we're aware of 4 women he's deceived, there must be more. It's like searching for a needle in a haystack. If you shake a handful of hay and 4 needles fall out, then the entire stack must be full of needles. We need to identify other husbands who might be aggrieved by his actions, I continued. Now, as for punishing him no matter what, I'd prefer he retains at least 1 intact and unharmed testicle. Steve seemed confused, which prompted me to clarify. If he loses both, he will still be able to take hormonal supplements and engage in intimacy. Alternatively, he may just lose the attraction. For example, wrap it with wire to block blood circulation, or perhaps break it with a hammer. Thus, he will still have a desire, but he will not be able to satisfy it. Besides, it will cause him psychological suffering. Steve burst out laughing. I knew that eventually he would share my idea with both Larry and Don. He had already talked to them and knew that they understood it. As I suggested, perhaps Clive used a similar tactic with their spouses, revealing the names of other lovers. We could tell others about it. He called Larry and Don before we left the bar. 2 days later, I visited the house where Susan and I once lived. Tony opened the door. You didn't waste any time, did you? What is it? She asked bitterly. Sue was handed the divorce papers this morning. Since then, she has done nothing but cry. The only times she seems calm are when she takes care of Connie and calms her down. I can't really blame you, but I thought you were going to hold off. She's really upset. I'm certain she'd never consider another relationship after this ordeal. Do you think there's any chance for reconciliation if you both attend counseling? She asked, hopeful. I shook my head. I was pretty convinced there was no future for us as a couple, and this confirms it. I passed her a paternity test report. The baby isn't mine. So, unless she was involved with someone else, Clive Adams is the father. She needs to pursue child support from him. Tony gazed at the envelope, tears streaming down her face. She was devastated. The realization that her hopes and dreams were shattered hit her hard. After a final embrace, she turned to inform her daughter. I had already informed my own mother. She was deeply saddened not to become a grandmother. She had chosen to stay home until the DNA results came in. She was too furious about Susan's infidelity to stay with Tony and Susan. She was another casualty of Susan's and Clive's deceit. The town was abuzz with talk of Clive Adams' affairs with married women in the days that followed. When Steve, Larry, Don, and I confronted our wives, we didn't shy away from naming him. In fact, we made a point to expose his actions. Though none of us were comfortable with the label of cuckold, we stood firm and shared the news of our wives falling prey to his advances. It seemed that Clive's charm only needed to include revealing previous conquests to Cheryl. The other women were simply swayed by his smooth talk. Despite their marital bliss, they were drawn to Clive's allure and seemingly enjoyed what he offered. Once his exploits became public knowledge, fathers of babies born to women associated with him insisted on paternity tests. I later heard of 2 more children he fathered. Suspicious husbands interrogated their wives about their activities. Some couples even sought counseling as a result. The complete scope of his actions remained undisclosed until Clive Adams himself revealed it, and he did so directly to the police. One might have expected that someone living the lifestyle Clive had chosen would keep their assets easily accessible in case of a sudden relocation. However, instead of converting his above-average income into cash, stocks, bonds, or other readily transferable forms, he opted to purchase a house and invest in multiple real estate properties. Even his household furnishings were extravagant, featuring valuable artworks on the walls alongside the typical assortment of hunting and fishing equipment common in our region. His boat was equipped for both water skiing and fishing. While law enforcement might not have initially pursued him, even if he had managed to liquidate his assets and flee, he could still have been tracked and pursued by private investigators. It's challenging to completely disappear when your social security number is required for any high-income, non-cash employment, regardless of how far you attempt to flee geographically. Clive may not have realized the danger he was in. He clearly underestimated the anger of the husbands. Instead of leaving the area immediately, he stayed and suffered the consequences. Just a few days after the news of his adventures spread, he was discovered on the sidewalk near his house while jogging in the morning. He was in a state of shock and was barely conscious. The runner immediately called an ambulance, but she had nothing with which to cut the straps binding Clive's arms behind his back. Clive screamed when she tried to turn him over, and she wisely refrained from seeing what would open up if she succeeded. When the paramedics arrived, they found his instrument crushed. The trail was left by a 3-pound sledgehammer. I picked up this tip from Larry, the policeman, while we were at the bar. He shared with Steve, Don, and me, both cheerfully and somberly, recounting how 2 detectives advised him that if he ever had a 3-pound hammer with unexplained tissue on it, he should dispose of the tool by dropping it into the swamp. Now, I had nothing to do with the unfortunate incident involving that guy's manhood, but I'm passing on the advice my fellow cops gave me, Larry said with a barely hidden smirk and a sly wink. Clive had no clue who had attacked him. He vaguely remembered hearing his doorbell ring. Whether it was late the previous night or early that morning, he couldn't recall. It was dark, and he had been asleep. "I think they used a stun gun," Clive recounted upon waking. "They shocked my private parts a few times. I remember that much. There might have been 2 of them, but I'm not certain. I was pretty out of it. One of them said something about never going after another man's wife. After that, it was just excruciating pain down there." Understandably distraught about the loss of his manhood, Clive was eager to see the culprit caught and punished. He provided investigators with the names of every woman he'd been involved with over the past few years, married or single with boyfriends. The list turned out to be surprisingly long. With so many leads to follow, the investigation became murky. Despite numerous suspects, there was no concrete evidence pointing to anyone. And due to the uncertain timing of the attack, alibis were weak. Privately, Larry confided in Steve and me that the investigating detectives believed Clive Adams had gotten what he deserved. After a few months, the investigation hit a dead end. As anticipated, Susan received half of our shared property. The house was sold, and another family moved their young daughter into the nursery I had meticulously painted with little animal designs on the walls. I hoped she appreciated my careful artwork. Susan returned to her mother's house because she found it challenging to care for the baby alone. At least with Tony, she wouldn't be lonely. However, I had no interest in knowing about her romantic life. She called me once to apologize, presumably after being confronted by Tony. However, she didn't specify what she was apologizing for, whether it was infidelity, getting pregnant by someone else, or my discovery and subsequent divorce. I didn't inquire. I had moved past it by then. When she suggested meeting to talk, I declined. She also asked if I knew about Clive's situation and if I was involved. I simply responded that he got what he deserved, and I ended the call. From then on, we never spoke again, and everything was handled through our lawyers. I pondered the amount of money she'd expend in attempting to legally compel Clive to provide child support. Knowing he wouldn't comply willingly, she'd inevitably secure the support. But the process of hiring a lawyer to pursue it would eat into her savings. Clive was contending with numerous similar legal actions, and I heard that measures were taken to prevent him from selling off his real estate holdings. With his own medical expenses, attorney fees, and forthcoming child support obligations, he wouldn't have much left for living expenses. And that's assuming he could hold on to his job. 18 months later. At 3 a.m, I found myself leaning against the lower rail of the Econ 626 rig in the Gulf of Mexico. The autumn breeze was brisk and refreshing, but my lightweight windbreaker provided ample comfort. This marked one of my final routine visits to the rigs. I had met a woman and decided she was worth pursuing. Our rapport was exceptional. While uncertain about the future of our relationship, I was now open to the possibility. It was time to embrace the job offer I had previously declined twice at headquarters. As I unzipped my jacket, I felt the weight of the lump hanging over my belt. Its persistence puzzled me. Despite attempting to discard it multiple times, I couldn't bring myself to let go. The risk of holding on to it was unreasonable. Yet it somehow provided solace. It was as if I had reclaimed a part of myself. Without further contemplation, I retrieved the heavy hammer from its concealment and cast it into the sea.